Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's August 27, 2018, and this is episode 630. This week we're going to take a look at exposure value, or EV, and I'll explain what it is, why it's useful, and why I've spent almost every waking minute for the last 17 days building a new exposure shift calculator for our photographer's friend app, which we'll use for some of my explanations. When we talk about exposure, we generally use aperture, shutter speed, and ISO settings to relay the absolute values of our exposure. But then, if you want to change one of the values while maintaining the same exposure, you have to change one or both of the other settings in the opposite direction. For example, if you are using an aperture of f8 with a shutter speed of a 250th of a second at ISO 200, and I recommend that you change your aperture to f11, which is one stop smaller than f8, and therefore lets in half the light, you would need to adjust the other settings to counter that change. You might change your shutter speed from a 250th of a second to 120th. This is twice as long, and therefore lets in twice as much light, so you maintain the same exposure. If though, for example, a 120th of a second might be too slow and you don't want to risk your subject moving during the exposure, making them blurry, you might decide to increase your ISO from 200 to 400, which makes it twice as sensitive and brings your exposure back in line. This can get a little bit confusing, especially if, for example, you don't want to change your aperture from f8 because it provides just the right amount of depth of field for the photograph you're making. You then have to think about how you could make the same change with other settings. If you're happy with your shutter speed, you could, of course, just change your ISO from 200 to 100, making it one stop less sensitive, and you'd have the same exposure as you would if you changed your aperture from f8 to f11. Although people sometimes refer to the changes made to exposure in steps, it's more common to use the term stop. Before we go on, although this is pretty basic photography theory, let's just recap that by aperture stops from, say, f1.0, counting in full stops would go from f1 through f1.4, f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, and higher. Depending on how you have your camera set up, you might have half stops between these, but generally most cameras and light meters use third stops. So, for example, between f5.6 and f8, you will have f6.3 and 7.1, though this varies slightly sometimes with different manufacturers. It's also worth noting that the smaller the number, the larger the aperture. So a lens set to f5.6 lets in twice as much light as when it's set to f8, and f16 lets in half as much light as f8. Stops in shutter speed terms are calculated by doubling or halving the time. For example, if your shutter speed is a 250th of a second, making it one stop slower would be 125th of a second. And that is also one stop lighter because the light hits the sensor for twice as long. Making a 250th of a second one stop faster takes it to a 500th of a second, which is also one stop darker because the shutter is open half the time. This continues even when we're using long exposures of more than a second. One stop longer than 5 seconds is, of course, 10 seconds, and 20 seconds is one stop longer again. ISO stops can be a bit confusing again, but similar to shutter speeds, you just keep doubling or halving the value for each stop. So ISO 200 is one stop more sensitive or brighter than ISO 100. ISO 400 is 1 stop brighter than 200, and 2 stops brighter than 100. If we keep going, we'll work through ISOs 800, 1600, 3200, and 6400. The thing to be careful with, of course, is that very high ISOs can start to introduce noise or grain to your images, but I'll regularly shoot at ISO 5000 or 6400 if necessary to get the shot. It comes down to testing your camera to see how much noise is introduced in various conditions and how comfortable you are with it. So, following that recap, let's talk about exposure values, which are also referred to as stops. But they can be more useful because when you refer to exposure in EV or exposure values, it's not tied to any one setting. According to Wikipedia, the exposure value system was invented in the 1950s and uses a relatively simple formula to calculate a value that can be used to represent any combination of camera settings. The EV scale can be mapped to various lighting conditions. For example, if you've heard of the Sunny 16 rule, which is a basic guideline to set your camera aperture to f16 and use your ISO as the shutter speed. So at ISO 100, you'd set your shutter speed to either 100th of a second or 125th of a second. This will get you a relatively good exposure on a sunny day, hence the name Sunny 16. Well, on the EV scale, the Sunny 16 rule equates to 15 EV. On a slightly overcast day, you might open up your aperture from f16 to f11, 1 stop wider, and this would mean you were shooting at 14 EV. For an overcast day, you might go to f8, another stop wider, and that is EV13. Conversely, you might increase your ISO from 100 to 200 for a slightly overcast day, or from 200 to 400 for an overcast day. And of course, you could change your shutter speed. But if you have an exposure value to work to, it's pretty easy to recalculate your settings. If we keep going back, the zero base for our scale can be represented as an aperture of f1.0 for 1 second at ISO 100. This is EV0. We can go darker using negative numbers. For example, on the EV scale, we have the Aurora Borealis at between -3 and -6 EV, and the Milky Way and Galactic Core at between -11 and -9 EV. I actually found these old values to be a little bit too dark if I compare them to my own images, such as, for example, the settings I used for this photograph of the Galactic Core that I shot on my Namibia tour this year. Please keep in mind that if you are listening on an iOS device, you can probably see the images that I'm talking about right there on your screen. But if you can't, go to the blog and follow along, and the blog post is at mbp.ac/630. I shot this photo at f1.4, which is 1 EV more than 1.0, putting me at EV1. I was using a shutter speed of 5 seconds, so to continue with our mental arithmetic to see how this changes the exposure value number, first I double the exposure from 1 to 2, which takes the EV back to 0, and then double the exposure again to 4 seconds, which takes us to -1 EV, and another second to 5 is 1/3 of a stop. So that takes our EV to -1 1/3. I also changed my ISO from 100 to 3200. So let's see how this affects the exposure value. First, changing from 100 to 200 makes my sensor twice as sensitive, so my EV goes up by 1 stop to -1/3. Doubling the ISO again to 400 is another stop, so we're back into positive numbers with 2/3 of a stop. 400 to 800 ISO gives us 1 2/3 EV, and 800 to 600 is 2 2/3 EV. Then finally, 1600 to 3200 is 3 2/3 EV. You might have noticed there that calculating ISO changes can be a bit confusing. For me at least, it seems as though the scale is going the wrong way. But because EV represents our camera's ability to capture the exposure based on how sensitive the film is, the exposure value goes up when we make our sensor more sensitive. Before I started to really look into how to calculate exposure value, I would certainly have guessed the opposite way, so this has taken some getting used to. I guess it's easier to think of EV as the target, as in the exposure value of the subject, not the base, which is the settings of the camera. For example, I've just used a light meter to take an incident reading of the light on this very bright, hazy summer afternoon in Tokyo, and my reading was EV 14 1/3. We can actually adjust to the Sunny 16 rule to understand that I'd get a good exposure at the moment by reducing my exposure by 2/3 of a stop from 125th of a second to an 80th of a second at f16. We'll come back to some more examples that will make this clearer, but for now, let's talk a little more about why using the absolute values of aperture and shutter speed, etc., isn't ideal. When we're shooting on my Japan winter wildlife tours, we are generally using manual exposure to ensure that our subjects stay well exposed, whether they are over white snowy backgrounds or a darker background like trees or the sky. This works great when the light is constant, but if there are patchy clouds, we have to change our settings quite regularly, and I shout out to my group that I'm changing my settings. If I simply shout out that I'm increasing my exposure by 1 stop, which is the same as saying I'm increasing my exposure by 1 EV, someone will invariably ask for actual settings in aperture, shutter speed, and ISO form. Then, if, for example, I say f11 for 1,000th of a second at ISO 800, I often get asked, what would that be if I'm at ISO 400? Or what if I'm at f8? And it's understandable because this can be a bit confusing. To help with this kind of exposure shift, I received an idea from listener Steve Jarrell last year for me to add a third calculator to our Photographer's Friend app for iOS. The implementation I've come up with is slightly different, but the idea is basically the same. So I've just this morning finished some very complicated development to create a third calculator called the Exposure Shift Calculator. This has been so much extra work and such a big change that I'm actually going to make this a paid upgrade to a new version of our app, but I'm currently looking into a way to provide a pseudo upgrade price for current version 2 users, and more details of that will follow over the next week or so. Today though, I wanted to introduce you to the new calculator to help shed a little more light on this discussion about exposure values. Because exposure values are at the core of all exposure calculations, this is at the core of my new exposure shift calculator. Here's a screenshot from an iPad Air showing the calculator set to EV0, which, as I mentioned, is the value that you get with an aperture of f1.0 for 1 second at ISO 100. When you first start using the calculator, you can, of course, dial in any combination of camera settings, but we'll work from EV0 for now to show you how this works. If you want to store your original settings for later reference, just tap the large Store Current Settings button in the middle of the screen, and your settings will be displayed there until you tap the settings again, which clears them and brings back the Store Current Settings button. I might, for example, use the calculator to find some settings to give me a good exposure at EV 14 and a third on this sunny day in Tokyo. And as we can see, if I select an aperture of f5.6 and leave my ISO at 100, I would need to set my shutter speed to a 640th of a second. In this next screenshot, I've stored my current EV0 settings for reference and dialed in my new settings so that you can see how the store function works. There are two ways to experiment with your settings after this though, starting with locking a single dial. If you tap the aperture, shutter or ISO dial labels, that turns them into my teal blue color and the padlock shows that it's locked. And now, when you turn one of the unlocked dials, the other unlocked dial will automatically update to the value that maintains the same exposure. I've locked the original settings in the middle of the screen for reference, and then locked the ISO dial, which would be useful, say, if you were shooting with film and literally could not change the ISO until the end of the roll, or, for example, if your ISO was already very high and you don't want it to go any higher. I decided that I wanted to change my aperture to f14, my go-to aperture for most of my landscape work. And you can see that the calculator automatically calculated that I would need to change my shutter speed to 100th of a second to maintain my exposure value of 14 and a third. I can, of course, then tap the aperture dial to lock that at f14. And if I change the shutter speed dial, it will give me a new ISO to use to maintain the same exposure. Note though that when you lock an individual dial that enables the ISO value to be recalculated, the EV will change, because increasing the sensitivity of the ISO increases your EV. So the other unlocked dial has to move in the opposite direction to maintain the exposure. That concept led me to what turned out to be the most difficult feature to code, the exposure value lock. If you tap on the exposure value number or the padlock to its right, any individually locked dials will be unlocked, but now when you spin any dial, the other two dials will automatically update to maintain the same exposure value. This was particularly difficult because not only did I have to calculate two other dials simultaneously, the ISO dial has to turn in reverse to maintain the exposure value. For example, if I lock the exposure dial at f14 and change the shutter speed from 100th of a second to 200th of a second, the ISO would change from 100 to 200 to counter the shutter speed change and maintain the same exposure. But because increasing the shutter speed increases the EV by one stop, and making the ISO more sensitive also increases the exposure value, my EV changes from 14 and a third to 16 and a third. So to lock the EV, I actually have to rotate the ISO dial in the opposite direction to ensure that the exposure value is maintained, rather than the exposure. I know that sounds weird, but that's what this took to achieve and actually provide a useful EV lock feature. If, for example, I have a meter reading of 16 and a third EV and I wanted to open up my aperture to f2.8 for some nice shallow depth of field, by locking the EV and selecting f2.8 on the aperture dial, the calculator would give me a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second at ISO 1000. That's useful to see your options while maintaining the EV, but in this case, if you know that you want an aperture of f2.8 and because you know that you have plenty of light, rather than locking the EV and going fully automatic, it would be better to simply lock the ISO and move your aperture dial to f2.8, and then you'll get your new shutter speed of a 5,000th of a second for a great outdoor exposure on a theoretically very bright sunny day. If, for example, you don't want the water in the fountain behind your model to be completely frozen by a shutter speed of a 5,000th of a second, you might decide to apply some neutral density filters. And to save you the trouble of remembering your shutter speed, I've also added a 2ND Calc button at the top of the screen, above the calculated shutter speed, which, as you might imagine, will send your new shutter speed directly to the ND calculator and open it up for you. This is also useful if you have calculated a shutter speed of 5 seconds or more and need a timer. Just jump over to the ND calculator and hit the timer button. Likewise, the 2DOF Calc button will send your aperture to the depth of field calculator so that you can see how much depth of field you have at the currently selected or calculated aperture. So I hope this has helped a little if the concept of exposure values wasn't something that you are familiar with. As with the other two calculators, as well as actually helping you to work in the field, they are great for learning the theory behind exposure and depth of field, as well as teaching it. Even if you have all of this down, there's nothing like being able to turn dials and show the effects of your changes to help people understand this stuff. Then, hopefully, when you're advised to increase your exposure by 1 or 2 stops, you'll be better equipped to calculate the difference in your head, or reach for your phone and open the photographer's friend. As I said, my current plan is to make this a paid upgrade, so if you like what you see but don't already own version 2, then please wait for a few days until I release version 3. If you are reading or listening after more than a few days into September 2018, version 3 should already be available. And for those of you that have version 2, I will try to provide a way to upgrade for a reasonable price, details of which will be provided in an update to version 2 in the app. If you don't need the exposure shift calculator, you're more than welcome to continue to use version 2, and I have a few improvements for version 2 that I will release very soon as well, so you won't be left out to dry. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please share a link with your friends. Subscribe in iTunes or your favorite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. If you have a moment to rate the podcast or leave us a review in iTunes, that helps to keep us relevant in the huge number of podcasts out there now. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and Google+, etc. And links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye bye.